This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel, netnumberfire.com, and this is episode 596 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel is offering an exclusive promotion for new sportsbook users. Join FanDuel Sportsbook today and make your first bet. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund of up to $1,000 in site credit within 72 hours. Your first bet after depositing will qualify. If you have multiple selections on one bet slip, it will be the first selection you made. Head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook today and place your first bet. Must be 21 years or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Max bonus $1,000 in site credit. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Same game parlay available for multiple sports in all states on mobile/web. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. In Connecticut, call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat. In Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. For confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-270-7117. In Tennessee, call the Red Line at 1-800-889-9789. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. Or in Arizona, call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT-STEP to 53342. Deebo Samuel is having the weirdest fantasy football season that I've ever seen, and that's not hyperbole. Across the first 9 games of the season, he had a target share per game average of 32.4%. He was averaging 21.7 PPR points per game. Over his last 3, his target share per game is just 9.5%, but he still scored 16, 21, and 13 PPR points because he's running the ball a lot, and he's running the ball extremely efficiently. He's averaging over 8 yards per carry over his last 3 games, and he's found the end zone on the ground in each of his last 4. If I'm being honest, I like the older version of Deebo, the one across the first 9 games. I like that one more than this new one. This feels a lot less sustainable than what he was doing before. It'll be really interesting to see how the 49ers operate with everyone healthy moving forward. Because if Elijah Mitchell's back, we could see Samuel play a more traditional wide receiver role. That would then hurt both Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle. But we'll see how they deploy their personnel. The last time a Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver finished in the top 20 in weekly wide receiver scoring was week 6. That's because Trevor Lawrence has 1 touchdown pass since week 8. On the season, the Jags have just 3 total top 20 wide receiver performances. That's tied with New Orleans and Cleveland for the worst in the league. On the flip side, the Rams are first in the league with 22 of them, and Tampa Bay is in second with 18. You can't trust a Jags player outside of maybe James Robinson right now, even in a great matchup this weekend. I mentioned this on the Sleeper Show last week, and I've been talking about Sony Michel on this show over the last few weeks now, but I still think there's a non-zero chance that he's the bell cow in that backfield, even when Darrell Henderson is healthy. He saw 100% of the Rams running back rushes on Monday night, and he's now rushed for 121 and 79 yards in back-to-back games. The Rams have also had good results in the win column. That can go a long way for coaches, even if it's irrational. Now, I understand that Michel is playing without Henderson, and Henderson was playing with Michel this season. So we can't necessarily look at Michel's last 2 games and see that he had a 92% and 100% running back rush share and just say that's higher than what Henderson has basically seen all year. Because he wasn't playing with Henderson. But I also don't think it's nothing. Having back-to-back games of 20 rushes is not nothing. And he's done that with a success rate of over 45%, which is really good. This trend is to say that we should be open-minded about any outcome here with the Rams' backfield. Hopefully we learn more about how they may divvy up the workload later this week. While DK Metcalf hasn't done that much at all since Russell Wilson's return, Tyler Lockett has. Over his last 4 games, he's averaged 18.8 PPR points per game with a low of 12.6 points. He now has 4 games with 25 or more PPR points. That's only been done this year by Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, and Tyreek Hill. The weird thing is that his target share per game over this time is 22.5%. That's actually lower than DK Metcalf's. Maybe things really won't turn around for Metcalf this year, but I have a hard time believing that. Anything can happen across a small sample, but we should expect at least some regression to the mean here. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's just how this stuff works. The last 4 weeks have not been very good for Joe Mixon's receiving work. He's averaged a target share per game of just 6.3% during this time. And he's seen 4 fewer targets than Samaje Perine. The rushing touchdowns were really helping Mixon. He had scored 9 touchdowns in 6 games prior to last week. But the looks through the air are definitely a concern as we move into the fantasy football playoffs. The Jets against running backs continues to be the best matchup in fantasy football when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. They're allowing 10.6 more PPR fantasy points per game to team running backs versus their opponent's average. Meaning if a team was averaging 15 points per game at running back and then they went and faced the Jets, we'd expect that team to score over 25 fantasy points at the running back position. And that's as a team, not an individual. The next defense versus position matchup that's worse in the league is Minnesota against wide receivers. When wide receivers face the Vikings, the team wideouts are scoring 8 more points than their season-long average. For some perspective, the complete opposite has happened against Buffalo this year, which I understand includes data with Tre'Davious White. But when teams have faced the Bills, they've lost 8 points versus their season-long average. Against Minnesota, they've gained 8 points. That's just something I found interesting when digging into the adjusted fantasy points allowed data this week. Josh Jacobs has silently put together a decent fantasy season. He's at least giving you some sort of floor each week. He scored 10 or more PPR points in 9 games this year. He's one of 9 running backs to do that. With injuries in that backfield, he's also seeing more work through the air, which is what Jacobs has always needed. Over his last 5 games, he's averaged a target share per game of 18.4%. His lowest target share in a single contest over this time is 10.5%. That's awesome. The usage is there each week for Jacobs to have an RB1 ceiling. You're never going to bench Travis Kelce in fantasy football. Let me get that out of the way. But over the last 2 weeks, Kelce has had identical 3 catch for 27-yard stat lines. He scored just 5.7 PPR points in both of those games. And he now has 4 games this year where he's scored in the single digits. And those 4 games are actually under the 7-point mark. He's obviously not giving you close to the edge that he gave you in 2020. Last year, Kelce had 1 single-digit performance. He finishes a top 10 tight end in weekly scoring in 93% of his games played. That number's under 70% this season. Again, you're not benching Kelce, but he just hasn't been the same dominant fantasy force this season. Trend 9 is that Ben Roethlisberger has now given us 3 top 10 fantasy performances over his last 4 games. Seriously. As I noted last week on the Sleeper Show, he's thrown at least 1 touchdown pass in every game since week 2 of 2019. That was a game that he was injured against the Seahawks. He then went on to miss the rest of the season. But Roethlisberger has hit 19 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4, and he gets a pretty decent matchup this week against Tennessee. He's not my favorite streamer this week, but he's at least in the streaming conversation. Let's end today's 10 Trend Show talking about Odell Beckham. Beckham now has double-digit PPR points in each of his last 3 games, and in 2 of those games, he's hit at least a 23% target share. He's becoming someone that you have to put in your lineup given the offense that he's in. He's seen target totals of 10, 5, and 7 over his last 3. Now, to give you some perspective, since the start of the 2020 season, Beckham played 14 games for the Browns. He scored 10 or more points in 5 of those games. So he's hit that mark in 3 consecutive games with the Rams, but he did it in 5 of his final 14 with Cleveland. Something tells me it wasn't just an Odell Beckham problem for the Browns. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.